What if none of that meant? What do you think? What if what you interpret as a sign, a message, or a special coincidence is just your brain desperately trying to make sense of the world? Have you ever had the feeling that I wanted to say something, even without any concrete proof? A number that repeats itself, a song that plays at the exact moment, a look that seems full of intention, an event that arises for a reason. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. The human brain is an extraordinary machine. It allows us to recognize faces in fractions of a second, make quick decisions, and survive in unpredictable environments. But this same capacity that protects us also deceives us. The brain was not designed to seek absolute truth. It was shaped to sense. Where there is noise, he creates patterns. Where there is silence, he invents explanations. Where there is no meaning, he constructs one. And the most unsettling thing is, he does all this so convincingly that we rarely notice. Perhaps you've already experienced that strange moment when everything seems to fit together too perfectly. Too many coincidences. Too many connections. The feeling that this can't be by chance. At those times, the brain kicks in like a skilled storyteller, stitching together loose ends into a coherent, comfortable, and often completely illusory story. Have you ever been through that? That sudden certainty that there's something bigger behind simple, almost banal events? Within the universe of scientific curiosities and the mysteries of the human body, few phenomena are as fascinating and as disturbing as this one. The human brain has an almost compulsive need to interpret, label, and give meaning to experiences. It hates gaps. It hates "I don't know." Faced with emptiness, it prefers to be wrong rather than admit it has no answer. And it is precisely there that many of the brain's strange phenomena arise. False connections, non-existent patterns, narratives created out of thin air. The most curious thing is that this process happens automatically. You don't choose to interpret it that way. The brain does it for you behind the scenes while you believe you are simply perceiving reality. Intense emotions, expectation, fear, anxiety, or hope act as fuel for this mechanism. The more emotionally involved you are, the greater the chance that the brain will see meaning where there is absolutely none. And here's an important point. This is not a sign of weakness, naivete, or lack of intelligence. On the contrary, intelligent, reflective, and curious people are often even more susceptible to this type of illusion. Because overthinking, connecting ideas, and seeking meaning is exactly what the brain does best. The problem begins when these connections seem so real that they cease to be questioned. Stay with me until the end of this video because understanding how the brain creates meaning where none exists is not just a scientific curiosity. It's a powerful key to understanding the decisions we make, the beliefs we hold, and even the emotions we feel without knowing exactly why. Throughout this content, you will realize that many certainties that seem solid may be just mental constructs, stories created to alleviate the discomfort of uncertainty. Perhaps, as you listen to these words, your own brain is already trying to piece together past experiences, recall specific situations, seek confirmation. This is natural. That's exactly how it works. The point is not to stop this process but to see it more clearly. Because when you understand the mind's tricks, you begin to observe your own thoughts from a different perspective. And it's precisely from here that things start to get even more interesting. And perhaps that's precisely why this type of conversation can't remain purely theoretical. Because while we talk about the brain creating meaning where none exists, each person watching carries their own stories, strange moments, striking coincidences, and sensations that are difficult to explain. If this topic resonates with you, if at any point you thought, "This has happened to me before," leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your experience isn't just about venting, it's a way to show you're not alone and to enrich this discussion with other real perspectives. When someone comments, likes, or interacts, it's not just a technical gesture on YouTube. It's a sign that the content touched on something important. That's what keeps this channel going, growing, and reaching more curious, reflective people who like to question what seems obvious. If this video is making you think differently, leave a like. It helps much more than it seems and shows that it's worthwhile to continue exploring this type of topic. And if you feel you enjoy exploring the mysteries of the human brain, those strange phenomena of the mind, those questions that don't have simple answers, then subscribing to the channel is almost a natural continuation of that conversation. Here, the idea is precisely to create a space where curiosity is welcome, where questioning is normal, and where science encounters the most intriguing side of the human experience. Your participation here builds a community. Every comment, every like, every subscription helps this message reach further, reaching other people who have also felt that their brain was telling a story that perhaps wasn't entirely true. And from here, things get even deeper because to understand why the brain does this, we need to look at something essential: how it deals with emptiness, with uncertainty, and with silence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain hates emptiness completely changes how you perceive thoughts, decisions, and even how you interpret reality itself. The human brain wasn't made to cope well with gaps. Blank spaces are unsettling. Cognitive silences generate tension. When something isn't explained, when information is lacking, when the story doesn't add up, the brain kicks in almost like a defense mechanism. It needs to complete, close, resolve. And if there isn't enough data, it creates it. This happens all the time behind the scenes of the mind. You don't perceive the process, only the result. A conclusion emerges ready-made, an interpretation seems obvious, a meaning settles in with a feeling of truth. But, at the origin, there is often only a void that the brain couldn't bear to leave open. For the brain, being wrong is better than not understanding. This phrase sums up much more than it seems. Being wrong brings relief. Not understanding keeps the discomfort active. Think about how many times, faced with an ambiguous situation, you felt almost an internal urgency to reach some conclusion. An unanswered message, someone's strange behavior, a subtle change in the environment. The brain immediately starts working, searching for clues, retrieving memories, connecting past events with what's happening now. Not because it's logical, but because it creates a sense of control. Emptiness breeds insecurity. An explanation, even a false one, generates stability. This mechanism has deep roots in evolution. In an unpredictable world, our ancestors needed to decide quickly. A noise in the woods could be the wind, or a predator. Waiting for complete information could be fatal. The brain learned that creating a quick hypothesis, even an imprecise one, was safer than being paralyzed by doubt. This pattern remains active today, only applied to completely different contexts. Relationships, work, expectations, personal choices, decisions that shape our journey. That's when the brain begins to build invisible bridges between facts that aren't necessarily connected. It transforms coincidences into signals, sensations into hidden truths, vague impressions into solid certainties. The less information available, the more creative this construction becomes. And the more emotionally involved you are, the more convincing the narrative seems. The brain mixes emotion, memory, and expectation, creating a story that makes sense, even if it isn't real. This directly impacts the mindset with which you view the world. Important decisions often don't stem from concrete data, but from interpretations created to fill gaps. The brain hates saying, "I don't know," so it says anything that sounds coherent. This artificial coherence is comfortable. It organizes internal chaos, reduces anxiety, and gives a sense of understanding. The problem is that, by accepting these explanations without questioning, you begin to live within versions of reality that may not exist. This process also influences profound personal transformations. Changes in direction, beliefs about oneself, perceptions of others. How many times does a single misunderstood experience become an absolute truth? A failure becomes, "I am not capable." A silence becomes rejection. A coincidence becomes destiny. The brain quickly closes the gap and, from there, builds entire decisions based on that initial interpretation. Behind the scenes, what's happening isn't malice or weakness. It's neural functioning. The brain prefers an imperfect story to a blank space. It prefers a wrong answer to no answer at all. Because emptiness demands tolerance for uncertainty, and that's something the brain by default tries to avoid. Prolonged uncertainty generates constant tension. An explanation, even an illusory one, generates immediate relief. Perhaps that's why so many people are drawn to simple narratives for complex phenomena. Quick explanations, ready-made truths, answers that seem to fit everything. The brain finds comfort in that. But over time, these constructs begin to shape behaviors, choices, and even how a person perceives their own identity. The impact is not small. It spreads silently throughout life. And the more you observe this mechanism, the more you begin to realize how automatically it operates. Thoughts arise as if they were objective findings, when in fact they are emotional responses to information gaps. The brain doesn't warn you when it's inventing. It presents the invention with the same confidence as it presents a real fact. That's the most intriguing and most dangerous part. When you realize this, something changes. You start to notice the inner urge to close stories too quickly. You begin to feel the discomfort of "I don't know," and the desire to fill that space with any explanation. This awareness doesn't eliminate the mechanism, but it creates a healthy distance. Pause. A space where new revelations can emerge. And it is precisely at this point that everything begins to gain another layer of depth. because when you accept looking at the void without immediately filling it, you open space to understand how these false connections are born, how they strengthen, and how they begin to influence your perception of reality. It is here that the hidden truth behind the workings of the mind begins to reveal itself. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is precisely where many people begin to confuse brain function with something mystical, supernatural, or special, when, in fact, we are talking about a common, automatic, and extremely human mechanism. The brain is an excellent pattern detector. It has been trained over thousands of years to find regularities in chaos. The problem begins when this ability, which was essential for survival, starts to operate in contexts where patterns simply do not exist. Seeing patterns where there are none is far more common than we imagine. And, most of the time, it happens so subtly that it seems natural. A number that repeats itself several times throughout the day. A song that plays just in time, when you were thinking about something specific. A random thought that arises shortly before an event happens, giving the strange sensation of prediction. At these times, the brain does exactly what it does best. Connects loose ends and transforms coincidences into signals. What's interesting is noticing how quickly these connections gain emotional strength. It's not just a neutral observation. There's an internal feeling of meaning, as if it carries a hidden message, a concealed truth waiting to be deciphered. And the more attention you give to these episodes, the more the brain begins to register them, store them, and retrieve them again in the future. That's how the impression that this always happens to me is born. But here's a crucial detail. For every coincidence you notice, there are hundreds that went unnoticed. The brain doesn't register what doesn't fit the narrative. It selects, filters, and highlights only what confirms the pattern being built behind the scenes. This process creates a powerful illusion of frequency and importance. It seems recurrent. It seems directed. It seems personal. But it isn't. This has nothing to do with mysticism. It's not supernatural intuition, nor a special premonition. It's pure brain function. The human brain doesn't work with real statistics. It works with emotional impact. An event that touches you emotionally gains more weight than dozens of neutral events. And so, little by little, the mind assembles a coherent, comfortable, and convincing story about what is happening. This tendency to create false patterns directly influences important decisions, career choices, relationships, and expectations about the future. When you believe certain signs are pointing you in a certain direction, you start acting according to that interpretation. Your mindset changes. Your perception of reality adjusts to the narrative you've created. And this has a real impact on your journey, even if the starting point was just a meaningless coincidence. Behind the scenes, the brain is always trying to reduce cognitive effort. Thinking that there is a pattern makes things easier. It gives a sense of order. It gives the impression of control. Accepting that events are random, disconnected, and unintentional is much more uncomfortable. The emptiness reappears. And as we have already seen, the brain hates emptiness. It prefers to fill it with a story rather than live with uncertainty. This is how seemingly harmless thoughts begin to take on disproportionate weight. This can't be a coincidence. There's something behind this. I felt it was going to happen. These phrases seem simple, but they reveal a profound process of meaning-making. The brain transforms coincidence into confirmation, emotional transformation into cognitive certainty. And little by little, the boundary between reality and interpretation begins to blur. What's most intriguing is that when someone tries to question these connections, an internal resistance arises. Because abandoning the pattern means abandoning the feeling of understanding. It means returning to the discomfort of not knowing. And that requires emotional maturity and mental flexibility. It requires accepting that not everything has a purpose, message, or clear direction. It requires tolerating chance. By observing this mechanism more closely, you begin to realize how many decisions were influenced by patterns that may never have existed. How many interpretations shaped behaviors. How many certainties arose from common coincidences, elevated to a special status by the brain. This perception does not invalidate personal experiences, but it changes the way they are interpreted. And the more you allow yourself to see this, the more you realize that the mind is a great builder of stories. Stories that make sense, that comfort, that organize internal chaos. Some are useful. Others are limiting. Still others only distract from the real complexity of life. The difference lies in perceiving when a pattern is real, and when it is merely an elegant creation to fill a void. This is where the conversation starts to get even more delicate, because if the brain is capable of creating patterns where none exist, it is also capable of creating images, faces, and visual meanings out of nothing. And when that happens, the sensation of reality becomes even stronger, almost impossible to ignore. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we talk about pareidolia we enter a territory where the brain not only creates abstract meaning, but literally creates it. Images, face and messages from nowhere. And the most impressive thing is that this happens to practically everyone at some point in their lives, even if the person has never heard this strange name before. Just look at the sky and notice a face in the clouds, see eyes in a light bulb, an expression on a car, a figure hidden in shadows or stains on the wall. The sensation is immediate, almost automatic. You don't decide to see, you simply see. This phenomenon occurs because the human brain has a very clear priority: identifying faces. Among all possible visual stimuli, none is as important as another human being. From the earliest moments of our evolution, quickly recognizing a face meant identifying allies, threats, emotions, and intentions. This was a direct matter of survival. Overestimating was safer than underestimating. And this pattern remains active to this day, operating silently behind the scenes of the mind. The brain doesn't wait for confirmation. It anticipates. It projects. It completes. Faced with vague shapes, indistinct shadows, or incomplete visual stimuli, it prefers to assume there's something there. A face. A gaze. A presence. Your brain prefers to see something that doesn't exist rather than ignore a real threat. This sentence perfectly summarizes the workings behind pareidolia. It's a protective mechanism, not creative imagination. The mind isn't inventing for fun. It's reacting to a world that, for millions of years, has been dangerous and unpredictable. What's curious is how this reaction is accompanied by a strong sense of reality. When you see a face that only has random shapes, it seems convincing. For a few seconds, maybe more, the body reacts as if it were real. The heart races, attention is fixed, the gaze returns to confirm. Even after rationally realizing that there was nothing there, the initial impression remains. This shows how visual perception is not neutral. It is interpretive. It carries expectations, memories, and emotions. This process has a profound impact on how we interpret the world. Because if the brain is capable of creating faces and figures from random stimuli, it is also capable of creating messages, intentions, and emotional meanings from ambiguous situations. Pareidolia is not limited to the visual. It extends to how we interpret behaviors, glances, silences, and gestures. A neutral expression becomes disapproval. A distracted look becomes judgment. Silence becomes rejection. Behind the scenes, the brain is always trying to answer the question, what does this mean? And the less objective information there is, the more it resorts to mental shortcuts. These shortcuts are part of our everyday mindset. They shape decisions, reactions, and even life paths. The transformation begins when we realize that not everything that seems obvious is real, and not everything that is felt has a concrete cause. There is also an important emotional aspect to this phenomenon. Situations of stress, anxiety, or fear make pareidolia even more intense. When we are emotionally vulnerable, the brain goes into a state of alert. It amplifies the detection of patterns, exaggerates signals, and interprets neutral stimuli as potentially relevant. This explains why, in dark, silent, or unfamiliar environments, the mind seems to see things. It's not weakness. It's a hyperactivated defense system. Throughout our personal journey, these visual and symbolic interpretations end up influencing deep-seated beliefs. Some people begin to attribute special meanings to random images, shadows, reflections, or shapes. Others see hidden messages in common objects, in dreams, in everyday signs. In many cases, this generates comfort. In others, it generates fear. The impact depends on the narrative that the brain constructs around the experience. The most intriguing thing is that the brain doesn't clearly distinguish between perception and interpretation. For it, what has been perceived already carries a degree of truth. Even when we rationally know it's an illusion, the emotional experience is still valid. That's why certain imaginary images remain in memory for so long. They weren't real, but the impact was. This phenomenon reveals something important about the nature of the human mind. We live in a reality that is constantly filtered, interpreted, and reconstructed. Vision is not just capturing light. It is interpreting the world based on past experiences, future expectations, and present emotional states. And the more attentive we become to this, the more we realize how the line between what exists and what is created is much thinner than we imagine. When you begin to observe pareidolia with curiosity, something changes. You start to question not only what you see but how you see it. You begin to notice the immediate impulse to give form, face, and intention to what is vague. And this perception opens up space for important revelations about decisions made automatically, quick judgments, and hasty conclusions that seem natural but arise from fragile interpretations. And all of this sets the stage for something even deeper, because if the brain creates faces and figures where they don't exist, it also creates complete stories, full of emotion and meaning stemming from subjective experiences. Stories that seem real, coherent, and personal. And that's exactly where the mind begins to wander even further. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely when emotion enters the scene that the brain ceases to be merely a hasty interpreter of reality and transforms into a true screenwriter. Emotion and meaning form a powerful combination. The more intense the emotion, the greater the brain's need to explain, justify, and give meaning to what is being experienced. The problem is that, in this state, the mind does not seek precision. It seeks relief. It seeks emotional coherence. It seeks a story that makes pain, fear, or hope seem bearable. Fear, anxiety, expectation, and hope act as amplifiers in this process. They increase the volume of interpretations and decrease the critical filter. When we are emotionally charged, any detail gains importance. A small gesture becomes a clear sign. A simple coincidence transforms into confirmation. A fleeting thought seems like a profound intuition. The brain, pressured by emotion, begins to force meanings, fit pieces that don't fit, create narratives that bring some kind of inner comfort. This is where many illusions become almost impossible to distinguish from reality, because they don't arise from nothing. They arise from real, legitimate, intense emotions. The sensation is real. The impact is real. What is not always true is the explanation that the brain constructs to justify what is being felt. And because this explanation is laden with emotion, it seems solid, obvious, indisputable. Perhaps you've already noticed this in moments of vulnerability. When something important is at stake, when there's a fear of loss, when there's a very high expectation regarding someone or some situation. At these times, the brain works at an accelerated pace, connecting memories, anticipating scenarios, filling in gaps with hypotheses that seem to make perfect sense. When we are vulnerable, the brain becomes a great storyteller. Engaging, convincing stories, and often completely detached from the facts. This mechanism has a profound impact on our personal journey. Important decisions are made based on emotional narratives, not concrete evidence. Mindset is shaped by these internal stories. The perception of the hidden truth behind situations becomes blurred. The brain confuses emotional intensity with objective relevance. What hurts more weighs more. What generates more expectation seems more significant. Behind the scenes, what happens is a desperate attempt to maintain internal balance. Intense emotions create disorganization. They create tension. And the brain responds by creating meaning. It organizes the emotional chaos through stories. Some of these stories help, others imprison. Some bring temporary clarity, others completely distort the perception of reality. But they all have the same origin: the need to reduce emotional discomfort. Anxiety, for example, is fertile ground for false interpretations. The mind begins to anticipate problems, to see threats where none exist, to interpret neutral signals as imminent dangers. The brain isn't trying to sabotage you. It's trying to protect you. But in doing so, it ends up creating a world that is more threatening than it really is. The same thing happens with hope. When we desperately want something to work out, the brain begins to see positive signs in every detail, reinforcing an optimistic narrative that may not have a real basis. This process also explains why some beliefs are so difficult to abandon. They are not only supported by ideas but by deep emotions. Questioning a belief is questioning the story that brought comfort during a difficult time. It's tampering with something that helped you get through a phase. That's why, even in the face of contrary evidence, the brain resists. It protects the narrative because it is linked to emotional survival. Throughout life, we accumulate countless stories created during these moments of fragility. Some become part of our identity. Others influence relationships, career choices, and worldview. The impact is silent but lasting. Many decisions that seem rational, when observed more closely, were born from emotional interpretations made to fill voids, alleviate fears, or sustain hopes. Understanding this doesn't mean invalidating emotions. On the contrary, it means respecting them without allowing them to completely dominate the construction of reality. There's a huge difference between feeling something intensely and believing that what we feel explains everything. The transformation begins when we manage to create a small space between the emotion and the story the brain tells about it. This space is uncomfortable at first. It requires tolerating uncertainty. It requires accepting that there may not be a hidden meaning, a hidden message, or a simple explanation. But it is precisely in this space that a clearer, more mature vision emerges, more aligned with the complexity of real life. A mindset that doesn't need perfect stories to sustain itself. The more you observe this mechanism in action, the more you begin to realize how many interpretations arise in the heat of the moment and solidify over time. The emotion passes, but the story remains. And this story continues to influence decisions, judgments, and expectations long after the original emotion has faded. This is one of the great revelations about how the mind works. We are not guided only by what we feel, but by the stories we create to explain what we feel. And when you begin to see this clearly, you realize that the brain doesn't just create isolated meanings. It creates complete narratives with a beginning, middle, and end. Narratives that explain who we are, what others do, and how the world works. Narratives so well constructed that they are rarely questioned. And it is precisely here that this conversation begins to touch on something even deeper, because understanding these internal stories is the first step to realizing how they shape the way you see yourself and the world around you. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when the mind begins to create complete narratives, we're no longer talking about just isolated interpretations or meanings. We're talking about entire stories being constructed, with a beginning, middle, and end, without you realizing exactly when this construction began. The brain isn't content with explaining a loose detail. It wants coherence. It wants continuity. It wants a logic that connects past, present, and future in a single, comprehensible line. It is at this point that independent events become connected as if they were part of the same plot. An old feeling meets a recent fact. A forgotten memory reappears to justify a current decision. A small event becomes the cause of something much larger. The brain looks at all this and says, with enormous inner conviction, this happened because of that. And this seemingly simple phrase carries a gigantic power over how we interpret life. The most curious thing is that this narrative doesn't need to be true to be effective. It only needs to seem plausible. The brain works like a story editor, selecting scenes, cutting out parts that don't fit, and reinforcing those that support the plot's coherence. What doesn't fit is ignored. What reinforces the story is highlighted. Behind the scenes, the mind is less concerned with objective facts and more focused on maintaining an internal sense of understanding. This process is profoundly human and linked to our need for identity. The stories the brain creates don't just explain the world, they explain who you are. I am this way because of this. This always happens to me. People act this way towards me. These phrases arise from internal narratives that connect real experiences with emotional interpretations, forming personal truths that are difficult to question. Throughout the journey, these stories solidify. An isolated event becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes a belief. A belief becomes a lens through which everything is interpreted. Important decisions begin to be made based on this lens, not on current reality. The impact is silent but profound. Many choices that seem rational are, in fact, only consistent with the internal narrative that the brain has constructed over time. The brain does this because coherence brings comfort. An organized story is less threatening than a chaotic and unpredictable world. Even if the story is harsh, it is familiar. Even if it is limiting, it is known. Questioning it means giving up a structure that gave meaning to past experiences. And this generates resistance. The mind prefers to maintain an imperfect narrative rather than face the void of not knowing exactly why certain things happened. This is how memories are reinterpreted. Memories are not fixed files. Each time you access a memory, the brain reconstructs it in light of the current story. New emotions color old facts. Meanings are adjusted. Small details take on new roles within the narrative. Little by little, the past is rewritten to make sense in the present. And this reconstructed version begins to be felt as absolute truth. This mechanism also explains why two people can experience the same situation and tell completely different stories about it. Each brain organizes events according to its own emotions, experiences, and expectations. Each person constructs a narrative that protects their own mindset, their worldview, their identity. There is no bad faith in this. There is only the attempt to maintain internal consistency. The danger arises when these narratives begin to be confused with objective reality. When the inside story starts to be treated as an indisputable fact. At this point, flexibility decreases. New information is filtered. Different opinions are seen as threats. The hidden truth behind the events becomes increasingly difficult to access because it doesn't fit into the already constructed narrative. This narrative construction profoundly influences relationships. A misinterpreted phrase connects to past experiences of rejection. Neutral behavior fits into a story of abandonment. The brain connects distant points in time and creates an explanation that seems logical, but which may have no relation to the other person's real intention. Still, the emotional reaction is intense because the story makes sense within the mind. The same thing happens with life decisions. Career changes, breakups, important choices. Often, they are justified by narratives that sound solid, but which were born from fragile connections between disconnected events. The brain creates a script that explains why that decision is necessary, inevitable, or destined. This feeling of destiny is, in fact, a side effect of the search for coherence. When you begin to observe this process, you realize that much of human suffering doesn't come from the facts themselves, but from the stories created to explain them. The mind cannot tolerate meaningless events. It needs to fit everything into a larger narrative. And the more emotionally charged the event, the more elaborate the narrative becomes. This perception does not invalidate the importance of stories. They are part of the human experience. They help us get through difficult times, learn from the past, and project the future. The turning point lies in realizing that stories are constructs, not absolute truths. That they can be revised, adjusted, questioned. That not everything needs to make sense immediately. When you create this space for observation, something changes. You begin to notice the automatic impulse to explain everything. You start to realize when a story is being created to alleviate emotional discomfort. And this awareness paves the way for freer choices, less reactive, less bound to old narratives. But this conversation can go even deeper because if the brain creates stories to explain events, it also creates stories to explain who you believe yourself to be. And these stories shape identity, self-esteem, and how you position yourself in the world. It is at this point that the mind stops merely interpreting reality and begins to construct its own notion of self. Write this down, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a delicate, almost invisible point where all of this ceases to be merely curious and becomes dangerous. The silent danger isn't in the brain creating meaning, that's natural, inevitable, and even necessary at many times. The real risk lies in believing too much in these meanings, treating them as absolute truths, and building entire decisions on something that has never actually been confirmed. When a meaning created by the brain ceases to be questioned, it becomes certainty. And certainties are comfortable. They organize the world, reduce anxiety, and give a sense of control. The problem is that often these certainties are not based on reality, but on emotional interpretations, internal narratives, and fragile connections. Yet they seem solid. They seem obvious. They seem indisputable. And that is precisely why they become so powerful. From this point on, the brain begins to filter out everything that doesn't fit the story that has already been created. Contrary information is ignored. Ambiguous signals are reinterpreted to confirm the narrative. The mind enters a mode of protecting its own story. Not because it is true but because it is comfortable. The brain doesn't seek truth, it seeks cognitive comfort. It wants to reduce effort, doubt, and internal tension. This directly affects important decisions. People stay in bad relationships because they believe in meanings that have never been questioned. Others abandon opportunities because they interpreted an isolated event as a clear sign that they shouldn't move forward. Some people build rigid beliefs about themselves based on poorly understood experiences. This happened because I am like this. Things always go wrong for me. People always do this to me. The brain creates an explanation, and from there the entire behavior adjusts. These rigid beliefs are especially dangerous because they disguise themselves as logic. They seem rational, well-structured, consistent with the past. But, in reality, they are just stories that made sense at some point of vulnerability and have never been revised since. The impact is profound. The mindset closes. The worldview narrows. The ability to see alternatives diminishes. The most subtle aspect of this process is that it rarely causes immediate pain. On the contrary, in the short term, it brings relief. It gives a sense of understanding. It provides an answer to difficult questions. However, over time, this comfort comes at a high price. It limits choices, reinforces fears, crystallizes beliefs, and prevents real transformations. The brain exchanges the complexity of reality for a simplified version that seems easier to handle. This is where the phrase gains its full weight. What makes sense isn't always what's real. Something can be emotionally coherent, psychologically comfortable, and yet be completely disconnected from the facts. The brain is not committed to objective truth. It is committed to internal stability. If an explanation maintains emotional equilibrium, it will be maintained, even if it is false. This mechanism also explains why it's so difficult to change one's mind. Questioning a profound meaning isn't just revising an idea. It's tampering with something that underpins entire decisions, identities, and trajectories. It's threatening the internal structure that has held everything together until now. That's why many people defend internal narratives so strongly. It's not arrogance. It's self-protection. Behind the scenes, the brain works to avoid the discomfort of, maybe I'm wrong. This maybe is dangerous for the mind because it opens the door to uncertainty, ambiguity, and change. And change requires energy, a review of routes, and a transformation of mindset. The brain prefers to maintain a false certainty rather than go through the temporary chaos of not knowing. The problem is that real life doesn't conform to internal narratives. It keeps presenting new situations, different people, unexpected contexts. When the narrative is too rigid, each event that doesn't fit generates frustration, conflict, and suffering. The mind tries to force reality to fit the story, and fails. And this failure is often interpreted as confirmation that the world is just like that, further reinforcing the initial belief. This cycle is silent yet powerful. It shapes entire trajectories without the person realizing it. Decisions are made automatically. Emotional reactions are repeated. Expectations become crystallized. Everything seems logical internally, but viewed from the outside, many choices make no sense at all. Yet, the brain remains steadfast, defending the narrative it has created. Understanding this mechanism is uncomfortable but liberating. Because the moment you realize that not every meaning needs to be taken as truth, space opens up for conscious choice. The possibility arises to pause before deciding, to observe before concluding, to question before believing. Not to live in constant doubt, but to avoid being held hostage by stories that were created solely to alleviate momentary discomfort. This awareness doesn't eliminate the brain's impulse to create meaning. It only prevents that meaning from becoming a prison. And when that happens, something interesting emerges: the ability to live with uncertainty without panicking. To accept that not everything needs an immediate explanation. To allow reality to be more complex than the stories we tell ourselves about it. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to approach something even more practical and transformative, because after understanding the danger of believing too much in the meanings created by the mind, an inevitable question arises: how can you learn to question your own brain without losing your emotional balance? That's when this journey begins to reveal a different path. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after understanding how the brain creates meanings, patterns, stories, and certainties that aren't always real, an inevitable question arises: how can you question your own brain without creating internal conflict? How can you develop a clearer mindset without falling into the trap of excessive self-criticism or paralyzing doubt? This is a fundamental part of that journey because it's not about distrusting everything, but about learning to observe the mind with more awareness. Questioning one's own brain requires a certain degree of emotional maturity. It's not intuitive because we were raised to fully trust what we feel, think, and perceive. There's almost an unspoken rule that, if I felt it, then it's true. But feeling is not the same as understanding. Thinking is not the same as stating. The brain produces content all the time, and not all of it deserves the same weight. Developing this distinction is a powerful transformation. A simple but extremely effective first step is to slow down the conclusion. Before accepting a meaning as truth, a question arises that changes everything. What real evidence do I have? This is not an aggressive or cynical question. It's an honest question. Real evidence isn't a feeling, it isn't isolated intuition, it isn't emotionally striking coincidence. Evidence is something observable, verifiable, consistent over time. Many internal narratives begin to lose their power when placed under this light. Another essential point is to consider alternative explanations. The brain tends to cling to the first story that makes sense, especially if it brings emotional relief. But there is rarely only one possible explanation for an event. Strange behavior can have dozens of different causes. Silence may have nothing to do with you. Failure may be the result of context, not personal inability. When you allow yourself to explore other possibilities, the single narrative begins to dissolve. This exercise is not intended to find the correct explanation immediately, but rather to weaken false certainty. It creates space. Space for nuance, for complexity, for a broader view of reality. And this space is fundamental for more conscious decisions. Many bad choices do not stem from a lack of intelligence, but from an excess of certainty based on incomplete narratives. Observing your own emotions before drawing a conclusion is another crucial step. Emotion doesn't invalidate thought, but it profoundly influences how we think. When an interpretation arises laden with fear, anger, anxiety, or expectation, it deserves extra care. Intense emotions act like distorted lenses. They amplify some details and erase others. Recognizing your emotional state is not weakness, it's clarity. It's realizing that perhaps that thought is saying more about what you're feeling than about what's actually happening. Behind the scenes, this process creates a different relationship with your own mind. Instead of fighting thoughts or trying to silence them, you begin to observe them. Instead of automatically identifying with every story that arises, you create a small distance. This distance is not emotional coldness. On the contrary, it allows you to feel without getting lost in the narrative. It allows you to choose how to react instead of just responding automatically. Questioning your brain is an act of intelligence, not weakness. It requires courage to admit that not everything that seems obvious is true. It requires humility to accept that we can be wrong. And it requires emotional strength to live with uncertainty without needing to immediately fill it with some kind of story. This kind of attitude changes how you position yourself in the world. It changes decisions. It changes relationships. It changes how you interpret your own past. Over time, this habit generates a profound impact. Rigid narratives begin to lose their power. Absolute beliefs become more flexible. The mindset becomes more open, less defensive. This doesn't mean living without convictions, but rather living with revisable convictions. Convictions that can evolve as new information emerges. This is a clear sign of emotional and cognitive intelligence. There is also an important side effect: relief. Paradoxically, questioning the brain reduces suffering. Many emotional pains are fueled by stories that are repeated without being examined. When these stories are seen as constructs, and not as immutable truths, something loosens inside. The pressure decreases. The rigidity gives way. The human experience becomes lighter, even in the face of real challenges. This practice doesn't eliminate the brain's impulse to create meaning. It will continue to do so. The goal isn't to control the mind but to understand how it works. It's about knowing when a story is helping and when it's limiting. It's about recognizing when an interpretation is merely an attempt to alleviate momentary discomfort. This awareness transforms the relationship with thoughts, emotions, and decisions. And the more you develop this skill, the more you begin to realize something interesting. The mind is not the enemy. It's trying to help in the way it knows how. But what worked in the past isn't always the best way to do it now. Questioning the brain is about updating internal strategies, not rejecting your own nature. This update paves the way for a different way of experiencing humanity. A way less held hostage by rigid certainties and more open to complexity. Less guided by automatic narratives and more by conscious choices. And it is precisely at this point that everything begins to connect with something even greater, because by learning to question the mind, you begin to see more clearly the difference between perception, interpretation, and reality. Write this down: I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when all of this starts to fall into place, a realization emerges that silently changes the way you see the world. After observing false patterns, internal narratives, emotions amplifying meanings, and the conscious effort to question one's own brain, it becomes clear that the reality we experience is not just something that happens outside of us. It is, to a large extent, something that is built from the inside, not as a deliberate lie, but as a constant adaptation of the mind to a world too complex to be absorbed in its raw state. The human brain is not a faithful mirror of reality. It is an editor, a translator, a creator of versions. It selects, organizes, simplifies, and interprets everything that comes through the senses. Sounds, images, memories, emotions, and expectations pass through invisible filters before becoming what you see. And this process happens all the time, without pause, without warning. What we call personal reality is, in practice, a continuous narrative created to maintain internal coherence. This doesn't mean that everything is an illusion or that nothing is real. It means that contact with the world always happens mediated by meaning. And these meanings don't arise from nothing. They are born from life history, from the mindset built over time, from experiences that have left a mark, from unresolved pains, from expectations projected into the future. Behind the scenes, the brain is constantly adjusting the external world so that it makes sense internally. Perhaps that's why silence is so unsettling. Silence of answers. Silence of explanations. Silence of meaning. The void leaves too much room for uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the feeling of control. So the brain fills it in. It creates hypotheses, stories, meanings. Some useful, others limiting. Some liberating, others imprisoning. But almost all arise from the same impulse: to make the world emotionally habitable. This perception generates a different kind of reflection. How many certainties do you hold today were born simply from the need to explain something that hurt? How many convictions were formed in moments of vulnerability and never revisited? How many important decisions were guided by stories that seemed solid, but which may have been merely attempts by the mind to avoid the discomfort of not knowing? When you start looking at it honestly, something interesting happens. Rigidity decreases. The rush for absolute answers loses its power. A more curious attitude towards one's own experience emerges. Instead of immediately asking, "What does this mean?" another, deeper question arises: "What is my brain trying to do right now?" This subtle shift completely alters the relationship with thoughts, emotions, and interpretations. The impact of this is silent but transformative. You begin to react less automatically. You start to realize when an internal narrative is being created to protect, not to reveal. You begin to see that many personal truths are, in reality, temporary constructs. Useful at one moment, questionable at another. This doesn't weaken the human experience, on the contrary. It makes it more conscious, more flexible, more open. There is something profoundly liberating in accepting that not everything needs to have an immediate meaning. That not every event carries a message. That not every coincidence points the way. Perhaps the world isn't so full of meaning. Perhaps it's your brain that can't stand silence. This phrase doesn't diminish the human experience. It expands it. Because when you accept silence, you also accept complexity, chance, the unpredictable. And accepting this isn't giving up on understanding. It's understanding on another level. A level where truth doesn't need to be simple, where revelations don't come in the form of rigid certainties, but of better questions. A level where the journey matters more than the perfect story. Where reality can be lived without the constant need to be explained. At this point, something begins to reorganize itself internally. The mind continues to create meanings, because that is its nature, but you are no longer completely confused by them. There is a space between what arises in the mind and what you choose to believe. This space is small but powerful. It is in this space that freedom of interpretation is born. It is in this space that decisions cease to be reactive and become more conscious. And the more this space expands, the more you realize that many of the certainties that seemed immutable were merely temporary versions of reality. Useful stories in a chapter, but they don't need to define the entire book. This realization doesn't close anything. It opens. It opens possibilities. It opens new perspectives. It opens a more honest relationship with one's own mind. Because ultimately, understanding the brain as a creator of reality isn't about disbelieving in the world. It's about seeing more clearly how the world is filtered, interpreted, and experienced. It's realizing that reality isn't just what happens, but what is meant. And when you begin to observe this process happening in real time, something inside you changes, silently, profoundly. And it is precisely from this awareness that other questions inevitably begin to arise, questions that do not seek quick answers, but more subtle revelations about how we perceive, decide, and relate to what we call real. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation has resonated with you. Perhaps an idea, perhaps a question, perhaps that strange feeling of recognizing something you've already experienced but never put into words. And that's exactly why this channel exists. To create this kind of space, where we can look at the human mind with curiosity, without ready-made answers, but with greater awareness. If this content helped you see the brain in a different way, if it brought clarity, reflection, or even a certain productive discomfort, then it makes sense to subscribe to the channel. That way you can continue following conversations like this one, which don't underestimate your intelligence and don't treat complex phenomena as if they were overly simplistic. If you'd like, leave a simple sentence in the comments just so I know you stayed until the end. It could be something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." Reading these responses helps a lot in understanding the real impact of what is shared here. And if at any point you felt that this conversation created a real connection, leave a like on the video. Not as an obligation but as a silent sign that this type of content makes sense to you. There's a video over there that complements this topic and further explores how the mind constructs reality. Click there and continue reading.